I'd been looking forward to the trip for weeks. It was early fall and the leaves in North Georgia were just starting to change. Red, orange, yellow bleeding across the ridges. I'd made plans with my buddy, Trevor, to spend a weekend deep in the mountains. Just the two of us, no phones, no work, no real responsibilities. Just tents, firewood, and whatever we could cook on a grill. It had been a stressful couple of months, and I needed the kind of break that you can't get at home. We left on a Friday afternoon. I drove, and Trevor handled the music and the GPS. The roads started narrowing after we got off the main highways. For lanes turned to 2, then 1, then twisted around tight corners flanked by dense woods. It was the kind of place where if you got lost, you'd be better off waiting for someone to find you than trying to get out on your own. But that was part of the appeal. No cell service, no city lights, no interruptions. We had all the major gear packed: tent, sleeping bags, a small cooler, and basic camp food. But snacks and beer? We figured we'd grab those last minute once we got close to the site. We pulled into a little gas station/grocery store in one of those tiny towns that barely show up on a map. It had maybe one main road and a few side streets, the kind of place where everyone probably knew everyone else. The store was small, with warped wooden floors and shelves that looked like they hadn't been restocked in a while. We grabbed chips, beef jerky, some trail mix, and then walked over to the cooler in the back. That's when we realized no beer, nothing, not even light beer or wine coolers, just soda, water, and a few sports drinks. We figured maybe they were just out, but after seeing the sign above the register, Dry County, it clicked. Of course, one of those pockets of the South where old laws still hung on like cobwebs. It wasn't something we'd thought to check ahead of time. Trevor asked the cashier, a woman in her late 50s with short gray hair and a thin face, if there was a place nearby to grab a few drinks. She didn't say much, just nodded and told us to head 10 minutes south, across the county line. Said there was a bar just past a bridge on a side road. Couldn't miss it. Gave the directions slow and clear, like she'd told them 100 times before. She never smiled, just stared with that same blank look like she was already thinking about something else. We paid, thanked her, and walked out with our snacks. We debated in the car whether it was worth it. We weren't trying to get drunk or anything. Just wanted to sit by the fire with a cold beer or two after setting up camp. The bar wasn't supposed to be far, and it wasn't like we were in a rush. Sunset was maybe an hour away, and we could still make it to the site before dark. So we figured we'd just stop for 1 or 2, then keep moving. We followed her directions. Drove south on the same 2-lane road until we crossed an old concrete bridge with rusting guardrails. Then a left turn onto a gravel road that split off at a crooked angle. Trees lined both sides thick enough that we couldn't see beyond a few feet into the woods. It was one of those roads where you start to second guess if you're going the right way halfway down it. But sure enough, about half a mile in, we saw it. A single building. No sign, no name, no neon beer lights or open banners. Just a low 1-story structure with all the windows bricked over. Not boarded, bricked. Like someone had gone out of their way to seal them permanently. The walls were stained, the kind of weathered brown-gray that happens when paint fades and no one cares enough to repaint. The roof sagged slightly in the middle. Above the door, which was just a wooden screen door that looked like it had been patched and repatched, hung a single light bulb casting a dim yellow glow. It was the only light anywhere around. We pulled the car up but left it running. Neither of us moved. We just sat there staring at the building. It looked more like a storage shed or an old hunting lodge than a bar. There were no cars out front. No music, no voices, nothing to indicate anyone was inside. The gravel under the tires crunched softly in the stillness. I remember the air felt colder than it had been 5 minutes earlier. I think we both knew right then that we weren't getting out. Trevor made some half-joking comment about the movie Deliverance, and I laughed. But it was that nervous kind of laugh that doesn't feel good. I kept my hand on the gear shift the whole time. We waited another minute. Nothing changed. No movement, no sign of life. Just that dim bulb buzzing quietly overhead. Eventually, we agreed without saying much that we didn't need a drink that badly. I backed the car up slow, turned around, and we left. The trees closed in behind us like we'd never been there. Neither of us said a word until we were back on the main road. We made it to the campsite as the sun dipped behind the ridges. It was a public site, but not a big one. Maybe 6 or 7 cleared spots spread out across a slope with fire rings and a single outhouse near the trailhead. There were a few other people there, small groups with tents already up and smoke rising from their fires. We picked a spot near the edge of the area, close enough to see the other sites but far enough for some privacy. That night we set up camp, built a fire, roasted some hot dogs, and shared a few cans of soda. We made some more jokes about the bar, about how it looked like the start of every backwoods horror movie, and how dumb we would have felt if we'd actually gone inside. I think we both wanted to laugh it off and forget about it. The next morning we were up early. The air was cold and damp, and I remember the smell of the fire pit still clinging to my jacket. We made coffee on the camp stove and sat in our chairs while the forest slowly lit up around us. Later that afternoon, we hiked a couple of nearby trails, passed a few other campers, and eventually ended up chatting with a group of guys sitting around a fire at the other end of the site. They were friendly, locals, probably in their 30s or 40s, with thick accents and that easy way of talking that made you feel like you'd known them longer than you had. We mentioned we were from out of town and told them about how we went looking for a bar after realizing we were in a dry county. When we started describing the place we'd found, the bricked windows, the single light, they stopped smiling. One of the guys leaned forward a little and asked where exactly it was. We gave the rough location. He didn't say much, just said, flat and serious, that place wasn't a bar. Never had been. He said it used to be a storage building for logging equipment years ago, but no one had used it in decades. Another guy confirmed it, said it had been closed up for longer than he could remember, maybe since he was a kid. They both looked uneasy when we told them we'd pulled up to it. They didn't give details. No one said what they thought it was now or what might have happened there, just that it wasn't a place you went. One of them shook his head and said we were lucky we didn't get out of the car. He didn't say it like a threat, more like a fact. We didn't push the subject. That night, we kept our fire small and stayed close to the tent. Even though we were surrounded by other people and knew we were safe, I still felt it. That edge of unease, like something invisible was following just a few steps behind. The next day, we packed up early. We didn't talk much on the drive home, just let the trees pass by the windows until the highways widened and cell service came back. I've been camping since then, plenty of times. And I still love getting out into the woods, unplugging, breathing clean air. But I always double-check the places I go now. I look at maps, read forums, ask questions. I learned something on that trip. Some places aren't on the internet. Some places don't show up on maps. And just because someone points you in a direction doesn't mean they want you to come back. We never found out who used that building, or what might have happened if we'd gone in. And maybe it's better that way. Maybe some things are best left behind a screen door and a single flickering bulb in the woods. I went camping with 2 friends in the middle of October. The weather was perfect. Cool days, cold nights, leaves just starting to fall. We planned to do 2 nights deep in the woods of Tennessee, near the North Carolina border. We'd done this kind of thing before. Drive out far, find an unmarked trail, hike in until we saw no signs of other people, then set up camp. No service, no reception, no GPS, just maps, a compass, and a solid plan to be alone in nature for a couple days. We parked off a gravel road that didn't show up on Google Maps. A dirt trail went off from the road, clearly old and rarely used, but walkable. We strapped on our packs and started in. It was peaceful, just the sounds of our boots on dirt and leaves, birds calling, occasional squirrels darting across the path. We hiked for about 3 hours, heading generally southeast, following an old logging trail that was hard to make out sometimes. Eventually, we came to a small clearing on a slight hill, surrounded by trees on all sides. It had a gentle slope, dry ground, and enough space for 3 tents. We set up and got a fire going. The sun dipped low behind the trees, and everything had that deep orange glow. No signs of anyone else out there, just us and the forest. That first night was normal. We cooked some food, drank a bit from our flasks, sat around the fire and talked. The cold crept in fast once the sun was gone, and we called it a night by 10. I crawled into my tent, zipped the sleeping bag up to my chin, and fell asleep quick. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a noise. It was faint but close, branches breaking, slow steps. I stayed still and listened. Could have been a deer, maybe a bear. It didn't sound panicked or fast, just slow and steady. Then I heard a soft thud, like a footstep on packed dirt. It wasn't an animal. Animals don't walk like that. I laid there, barely breathing, heart thumping in my ears. I heard nothing for maybe 10 minutes, then one more footstep closer, then silence. I didn't sleep after that. I just stayed there, eyes open, heart pounding. Eventually, the gray of morning crept in and the birds started up. When I unzipped my tent and looked around, everything was exactly as we left it. My friends were both up, one stoking the fire back to life. I didn't mention what I heard. It felt weird to bring it up without anything solid to say. We spent that day hiking, following the creek down the hill for a while, just taking in the woods. Found a spot where a tree had fallen over and let a bunch of sunlight in. We sat there for a while, eating trail mix, soaking in the warmth. Nothing felt off during the day, but once we got back to camp that evening, something did. The fire pit had been disturbed, not like scattered or ruined, just adjusted. The rocks we'd placed around it were moved slightly, like someone had taken them off and put them back in the same shape but in different positions. We all noticed it. None of us said anything right away. It was one of those things where you look at something and know it's off, but your brain doesn't want to accept it. Eventually, one of the guys said something like, "Did either of you mess with the fire pit?" We all said no. That was it. We didn't talk about it more, but I could feel the tension grow after that. The sun went down earlier that night. None of us drank. We ate quietly and went into our tents early. That second night, I couldn't sleep at all. I kept hearing things, small noises, like something brushing against a tree or stepping lightly on leaves. I stayed completely still, my ears tuned to every sound. Around 2 a.m., I heard what sounded like whispering. Not words I could make out, just a soft, broken murmur. It was distant, but it was there. My stomach sank. After a while, the whispering stopped. Then came the footsteps again. Soft, slow, deliberate, closer than the night before. I stayed motionless, eyes wide open, barely blinking. The steps stopped outside my tent. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just listened. I don't know how long it stood there. It felt like forever. Then I heard it walk away, slow and steady, into the woods. The rest of the night was dead quiet. By the time the sun came up, I was already out of my tent. My friends looked just as tired as I felt. None of us said anything. We just packed up. It was understood. We needed to leave. We hiked back the way we came, fast. We didn't stop for food or rest. We just walked. It took us nearly 2.5 hours. When we reached the car, I looked back once, and I swear I saw something standing way back in the trees, just barely visible between the trunks. It didn't move. I didn't look long enough to make out details. I just got in the car. On the way back, we didn't talk much. About an hour into the drive, one of the guys finally said, "That was messed up." We all agreed. No one needed to say what that was. We just knew. A few days later, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I started reading about missing hikers in that area. I found a handful. None of them were connected, but all were in the same general region. Some were years apart, some recent. One guy was never found, just his camp torn apart, his gear all over the place. Another had disappeared on a solo hike, and they found his body 2 weeks later, down a ravine with injuries that didn't match a fall. It made my stomach turn. I kept going over the sounds, the steps, the whispering, that disturbed fire pit. We weren't alone out there. Someone was out there with us. The whispering wasn't a hallucination. The steps weren't animals. The way that Rock Ring had been reset, careful, intentional. That wasn't a bear. That wasn't some kid playing a prank. We were being watched, followed. I don't camp deep in the woods anymore. If I do go, it's somewhere populated, somewhere with cell service and people nearby. That trip changed something in me. I still love nature, but I know now that it's not just animals and trees out there. There are people who live in the forgotten places, people who don't want to be found, people who might be watching when you think you're alone. and they don't always have good intentions. We got lucky. We left before it got worse. I don't know what would have happened if we stayed another night. Maybe nothing. Maybe something that would have ended up on one of those missing persons lists. I think about that night a lot. The silence, the whispering, the footfalls, that moment outside my tent. I don't think it was curiosity. I think it was a warning. We were somewhere we didn't belong, and someone out there wanted us to know it. When I was a kid, my parents were really into camping. Every summer, once school was out and my dad had a couple weeks off from work, we would hook up the old white and blue caravan to the back of our car and head off to some remote campground in the woods. They were always the quiet kind of places, not the busy, touristy ones with camp stores and playgrounds and lots of other families. My parents liked the simpler spots, the ones where all you could hear at night were the sounds of crickets, frogs, and the occasional owl. This particular summer, I was probably around 10, and my sister, Emily, was 8. We'd been on a few trips by then, so we were used to the routine. We knew how to help set up camp, how to roll out our sleeping bags, how to stack the firewood, and how to chase off raccoons if they got too curious. But this trip felt a little different from the start. For one thing, the campground we picked was more isolated than usual. It was just a handful of sites nestled between thick woods and a long gravel road that barely saw traffic. There weren't any nearby campers either. My parents liked it that way. It was the first time Emily and I asked to sleep outside the caravan in our own tent. We'd seen other kids do it in previous years, and we figured we were old enough. It was a little 2-person dome tent, the kind you could set up in 15 minutes. We helped Dad pitch it right in front of the caravan door so that our parents could still keep an eye on us. The ground was flat, the grass was short, and we laid down 2 inflatable mattresses inside, set up our sleeping bags, and tossed in a couple flashlights and our favorite books. That tent felt like our own little house. The first part of the night was fine. We roasted hot dogs over the fire, made s'mores, then crawled into the tent as the sun went down. We talked for a while with our flashlights on, giggling about nothing in particular. The air was cool, and it smelled like pine and smoke. The canvas of the tent was thin, but it made us feel separated from the rest of the world. I remember waking up in the middle of the night, sometime after midnight, because something didn't feel right. It wasn't a noise at first, just a weird kind of awareness. The air had gotten colder, the kind of cold that comes in waves. The quiet was different, too. I couldn't hear the usual night sounds, no insects, no frogs, nothing. It was dead silent. I lay there for a bit, trying to figure out what felt so wrong. That's when I heard it. A soft rubbing noise, like something brushing against the outside wall of the tent, came from the left side, close to my head. I froze. It wasn't loud, but it was very clear. Something was moving right outside. The tent walls shifted slightly, like they were being lightly pushed. My first thought was that it was a person. Maybe someone had come into the campground. Maybe they were walking around the tent, looking for something. My chest tightened. I glanced over at Emily, who was awake too. I could tell she had heard it. Her eyes were wide in the dim glow of her flashlight. The rubbing sound stopped for a few seconds, then started again, this time from the other side of the tent. It was low, near the ground. A slow, shuffling brush, like something dragging or crawling. We didn't say anything. We just lay there, holding our breath, listening. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. We stayed like that for what felt like forever. Then it stopped. Completely. The silence came back, and I waited, staring at the top of the tent, too afraid to move. Eventually, I think I fell asleep again. But I remember waking up early, just before sunrise, and crawling out of the tent. Everything looked normal. The grass was undisturbed, the morning air was still, and the caravan door was still shut tight. That evening, after another long day of walking trails and eating by the fire, Emily and I tried again. We weren't exactly eager, but we told ourselves it was probably nothing. Maybe just the wind, maybe a branch. We didn't want to seem scared. Took a while to fall asleep that night. Every tiny sound outside made me tense up. Around the same time as the night before, maybe close to 1 in the morning, I heard it again. The same soft rubbing sound. the same slow movement across the wall of the tent. And again, it circled from one side to the other. Emily grabbed my hand, and we both started breathing faster. I felt the bottom edge of the tent flutter just slightly, like something was touching the ground fabric from underneath. That's when we started yelling. We didn't even think. We just screamed as loud as we could. A few seconds later, I heard the caravan door swing open and footsteps on the grass. The rubbing sound stopped instantly. My dad called out, and we unzipped the tent and bolted into the caravan without looking back. I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. In the morning, our dad walked around the tent and the campsite, looking for anything unusual. There were no footprints, no broken branches, nothing really out of place. But Emily and I had made up our minds. We weren't going back into that tent. Not for the rest of the trip. For the next few nights, we slept in the caravan again, feeling much safer with the solid walls around us. It was kind of disappointing, though. We'd really wanted to prove we could do it. But the fear stuck with us. On the second to last day of the trip, while we were starting to pack up some of the gear, my dad began to take down the tent. He unzipped it, took out the sleeping bags and mattresses, then knelt down to pull out the stakes. That's when he noticed something strange. The ground beneath the tent was uneven. When he rolled up the tarp, he found that a section of grass and soil near the rear end of the tent had sunken slightly. He pushed at it with his boot and the dirt gave way, revealing a small tunnel. Not wide enough for a person, but big enough for an animal. Maybe multiple. We looked closer and found more soft spots in the ground around the tent. Narrow channels of dugout soil, hidden just below the surface. It looked like a small network of tunnels ran right underneath where we had been sleeping. Our dad said it was probably some kind of ground-dwelling animal. Maybe moles or voles or groundhogs. They must have been burrowing under the tent during the night, which would explain the sound and the faint movement we'd felt. Since we were lying on air mattresses, we didn't feel any vibration from below, just heard the brushing against the sides of the tent. It made sense, all of it. But even knowing that, I couldn't shake the feeling I'd had those nights. That raw fear, that cold silence before the sound started. It had felt too purposeful, too slow. But maybe that's just how our minds work when we're scared. We imagine patterns. We assign intent where there isn't any. Years later, it's a funny story, something we laugh about when the family gets together. But I still remember that feeling. I remember how sharp the air felt, how the sounds came in waves, how the silence pressed in all around us before it started again. It wasn't ghosts or monsters or people. It was just animals doing what animals do. But in the dark, alone in a tent, your brain doesn't care. Fear doesn't need logic. It just needs a sound in the night and a wall that's too thin. I never slept in a tent again after that summer. Not because I was scared of animals or noises, but because I didn't like how it made me feel. That open, exposed feeling. That helplessness. Some people love it. I get that. But for me, it was enough. I had learned that the world doesn't need to be supernatural to be terrifying. Sometimes it just needs a quiet night, a thin wall, and the unknown just inches away. It was early October when I decided to take a few days off work and head into the woods for a solo camping trip. I'd been meaning to do something like this all summer, but kept putting it off. I didn't want to deal with tourists or crowded trails, and now that fall had rolled in, I figured it was finally the right time. The air was cool but not freezing, and the leaves were starting to change into deep oranges and reds. I picked a spot I'd found a couple of years ago while hiking a lesser-known trail in the northern part of the state. It wasn't an official campsite, no fire pits or picnic tables or outhouses, but it had a flat clearing, a decent view of the valley below, and a freshwater stream about 100 yards downhill. Best of all, no one ever seemed to go out that way. I packed light but smart. I brought my two-person tent, a sleeping bag rated for 20 degrees Fahrenheit, a small hatchet, water purification tablets, and just enough food for 4 days. I also brought my GPS unit, a map, and a simple first aid kit. I wasn't new to this. I'd done plenty of backcountry hiking and camping before, and I liked being prepared. There's a difference between roughing it and being reckless. It took me about 5 hours to hike out to the site. The trail was narrow and winding, and I had to bushwhack a little to get to the spot I had in mind. I reached the clearing around 4 p.m. and got to work setting up camp. The tent went up easily. I found a good place to string my bear bag up high and out of reach just in case. After that, I filtered some water from the stream and made a small dinner of rice and dehydrated beans. As the sun went down, I sat back on a fallen log and watched the sky turn dark. The stars were clear and bright, and the forest was quiet in that way that makes every small sound feel louder than it really is. The first night was peaceful. I slept straight through, waking only once to adjust my sleeping bag when the cold crept in around 3 a.m. The next morning, I had oatmeal and black coffee and went for a short hike to a ridge I remembered. The rest of the day passed slowly, in a good way. I read a book, took some notes in a journal, and gathered some extra wood for the fire. I wasn't allowed to make a big fire. It was technically against park rules to camp off-trail, but I made a small one in a dugout pit and kept it controlled. I just wanted the warmth and a bit of light. It was the second night when things started to feel off. Around 1 a.m., I woke up needing to pee. It was colder that night, and the ground was hard and frosty. I put on my boots and stepped outside. I didn't go far, maybe 20 feet from the tent. While I was out there, I thought I heard something move in the woods behind me. Not a big movement like crashing or stomping, just a soft rustle like leaves being disturbed. I stopped mid-step and turned, trying to see through the trees. I couldn't spot anything, but the hairs on my neck were standing up. I waited a minute listening, then I heard it again. Another rustle, this time farther off. Could have been an animal, deer maybe, or even a raccoon. I tried not to let it get to me, but I didn't take my eyes off that part of the woods as I walked back to the tent. I zipped it shut and climbed inside, feeling a little exposed even under the nylon walls. I didn't sleep well after that. By morning, I had mostly convinced myself it had just been a normal forest sound. Animals do move around at night. The woods are full of life, even when you can't see it. Still, I kept glancing toward the treeline while I made breakfast. I also checked around camp for tracks just out of habit. I didn't see anything unusual. Later that day, I walked to the stream again to refill my bottles and wash out the pot I'd used. On the way down, I saw something strange. About halfway between camp and the water, there was a small pile of rocks stacked together at the base of a tree. It wasn't there the day before. It looked deliberate, maybe 10 or 12 stones, all balanced in a tight stack. They weren't naturally arranged like that, and they weren't the kind of rocks that would have just rolled there on their own. I stared at them for a while, then crouched down and looked around. There were no boot prints or broken branches nearby, just that weird pile of rocks, sitting there like some kind of marker. I didn't touch them. I kept walking and got my water, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else had been nearby. When I got back to camp, I checked all my gear. Nothing was missing or moved, but I still felt uneasy. That night, I built the fire up a little bigger, trying to push back the dark. I didn't see or hear anything strange, but I didn't sleep well again. I kept waking up to every little sound. An owl calling, the creak of a tree in the wind, small scurrying noises that could have been anything. When morning came, I felt groggy and tense. I decided to stay close to camp and keep my eyes open. I wasn't scared exactly, but something didn't feel right. I kept thinking about that stack of rocks. Who would be out here? Why would they mark anything? Around noon, I heard something that wasn't natural. It sounded like metal scraping on metal. It was faint but clear. I stood up and turned in a full circle, listening. Came again from down near the stream. A hard, quick screech, like a shovel being dragged across rock. I grabbed my hatchet and started moving downhill, staying low and quiet. I didn't want to confront anyone, but I needed to know what was going on. When I got close to the stream, I crouched behind a fallen tree and listened. The scraping sound came again, then stopped. I waited a long time but didn't hear anything else. Finally, I stood and walked carefully to the edge of the water. There was no one there, no tools, no gear. But about 20 feet upstream, I saw another pile of rocks. This one was bigger, maybe 20 stones, all balanced in a shape like a cone. Again, it looked intentional. I scanned the area, heart thudding. Nothing moved. I turned and walked back to camp fast, Not running, but not wasting time either. The woods felt too quiet. I started packing my gear. I didn't care that I had one more night planned. I didn't want to be out there anymore. I could hike back before nightfall if I moved quickly. That's when I found the third pile. It was right behind my tent. I hadn't seen it when I left earlier, but it was sitting there now, maybe 10 feet from where I'd slept. Smaller than the others, maybe 5 stones. But one of them was a flat river rock, and scratched into the surface was a single straight line, like someone had dragged a sharp object across it. Not a letter, not a word, just a line, a mark. My stomach turned. I looked around in every direction. The trees were still. The wind had died down, but I knew then, absolutely knew, that someone was messing with me. Someone had been near my tent while I slept. I didn't even break down the tent properly. I threw everything into my pack, yanked the poles loose, and started hiking out. I took the trail fast, even though it was rough and winding. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I moved like something was chasing me, and the worst part was, I started to think something was. About 30 minutes into the hike out, I heard the sound again, the scraping metal, this time closer. I stopped cold and looked behind me, but the woods were still. No movement, but I could feel it, eyes on me. I picked up my pace, nearly jogging, trying not to trip. Every now and then, I'd hear something in the trees, snaps, rustles, the occasional scrape, but I didn't stop again. It took me 4 hours to reach the trailhead, nearly 2 hours less than it should have. My legs were shaking. My back was sore from the pack bouncing. I didn't stop until I reached my car, threw my gear in, and locked the doors. On the drive home, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting someone to be following me, but the road stayed empty. When I got home, I dumped everything in the garage and took a shower that lasted almost an hour. I couldn't stop thinking about those rock piles, about the scratches, about the sounds. I didn't sleep that night. 2 days later, I called the local ranger office and asked if there had been any reports of strange activity in that area. They said no. They told me the region was rarely visited and that I shouldn't have been camping off-trail anyway. I didn't argue. I just thanked them and hung up. I haven't been back to that part of the woods since. I still hike, but I stay on marked trails now. I camp only at designated sites near other people, and I never, ever go alone anymore, because whatever was out there wasn't an animal, and it wasn't a ghost. It was a person, and they wanted me to know they were there. It was sometime in late July when a group of my friends and I decided to head out for a weekend camping trip. We'd been talking about it for a while, just getting away from everything, getting off our phones, spending a couple nights out in the woods, away from all the usual distractions. We were all in our early 20s, some of us fresh out of school, some working jobs that didn't offer much time to breathe. It seemed like the perfect way to recharge. There were 5 of us total. We packed into 2 cars and drove about 3 hours north of town, out past the last scattered houses, beyond where streetlights still stood, until we hit the edge of a public forest area. There was a stretch of gravel road that twisted its way through trees for several miles until it opened into a small clearing. It wasn't a designated campsite, just one of those tucked-away patches of open ground that felt perfect. No one else was around, and it didn't look like anyone had camped there in a while. We were pumped. We set up 2 tents. One of the guys had a larger 4-person tent, and the rest of us were going to sleep in a smaller 2-person one. I ended up in the smaller one with my friend Marcus. The others took the bigger one, and we set them up maybe 20 feet apart with a fire pit between us. We got to work gathering firewood, setting up camp chairs, unloading coolers full of food and drinks. We had our little home away from home in no time. That first evening was awesome. We grilled hot dogs and burgers on a small camp stove, cracked open drinks, and stayed up well past midnight. There wasn't much light apart from the fire and a few weak lanterns, but we didn't mind. We were laughing, swapping stories, even trying to spook each other with some of the creepy things we'd seen online. Eventually, we all crashed, half drunk and tired from the long day. Marcus and I crawled into our tent, unrolled our sleeping bags, and set up on top of some inflatable pads we'd brought. It was warm out, so we left the rain fly off the tent, just using the mesh top and sides to let the night air in. I remember looking up through the trees at the stars for a while. It was dead quiet except for a few crickets, maybe a distant owl. I fell asleep fast. I don't know how long I was asleep before I woke up the first time. Maybe an hour, maybe less. What woke me was this strange sound, like a faint rubbing. It was subtle, almost like fabric against fabric or something brushing the outside of the tent wall. My eyes opened and I lay there still, listening. It wasn't wind. There was no breeze that night. I could hear it plain as day, this light, irregular rubbing noise. I thought maybe Marcus was moving around, but he was sound asleep. I waited, holding my breath. Then it stopped. Total silence again. I chalked it up to an animal, maybe a raccoon or some other little critter sniffing around. Nothing to be scared of. I let myself relax and drifted back to sleep. A second time, I woke up again to that sound. This time it was louder, the same rubbing, scraping noise, but it was moving. I could hear it shifting from one side of the tent to another, like something was circling us, brushing up against the nylon. I sat up a little, trying to peer out into the dark through the mesh, but I couldn't see a thing. The fire had gone out and the woods were pitch black. I reached over to shake Marcus, but then stopped. I didn't want to freak him out over nothing. Still, the sound unnerved me. I sat there for maybe 10 minutes, listening. The rubbing sound would stop, then start again. Always faint, always moving. Eventually, I lay back down, telling myself it was probably an armadillo or a possum, something small and harmless. But the third time I woke up, it was different. It wasn't just the sound, it was the feeling. The tent wall behind me flexed in just slightly. It was like someone or something was pushing against it, just enough that I could feel the movement against my back. It wasn't strong, but it was there. I rolled away from it fast, my heart pounding. Now I was fully awake. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent, and shined it around outside. Nothing, not a sound, not a stir. The woods were dead still. I stayed crouched there at the flap for a while, scanning in every direction. Eventually, I zipped it shut again and lay down. But sleep didn't come easy after that. The next morning, I mentioned it casually to the rest of the group. Just said I thought an animal had been messing with our tent. No one else had heard anything. They teased me a bit, said I was probably dreaming. I didn't push it. That night, we stayed up later than the night before, watching the fire burn down to glowing coals. The sky clouded up a bit, and we knew rain might be coming the next day. We joked around less. There was something about the deep woods that felt heavier at night, like it pressed in more when the stars weren't out. Back in the tent, I lay there awake longer. Marcus was snoring lightly, and the sounds of the night felt louder than they had the night before. More creaks from the trees, more rustling in the brush. I kept my flashlight close, and then again the rubbing. Only this time it was different. It was faster, more deliberate. It sounded like it was coming from two sides at once. Long swipes, slow dragging motions against the nylon. I sat bolt upright and listened. It went quiet again. Then a new noise, something that sounded like digging. The sound came from right under the tent. A deep, faint scritching. I leaned down and pressed my ear to the ground pad. It was real. Something was under us. I reached over and shook Marcus awake. He groaned, turned, then sat up when he realized I wasn't joking around. I pointed to the ground. We both stayed there, silent, listening. The digging noise stopped. Neither of us wanted to be the one to go outside. We just sat there for a long while until the first gray hints of dawn started to light the tent. Then, little by little, the unease began to fade. When we stepped outside, everything looked normal. No damage to the tent. No tracks. Just a quiet, dewy forest. The others were already up, cooking breakfast. I didn't say much, and Marcus didn't either. We were both a little off. That day, we stuck closer together as a group. Did a little hiking, then played cards and made food. But that edge of tension didn't really go away. We didn't sleep in that tent again. That afternoon, it started to drizzle. We told the others we'd rather just bunk in the big tent for the last night. They didn't argue. That last night, it rained pretty steadily, and the patter of droplets drowned out any of the other sounds we might have heard. I actually got a full night's sleep. The next morning, we started packing everything up. When Marcus and I took down the little tent, that's when we saw it. Right under where the tent had been set up, the ground had been disturbed. There were little tunnel mounds, like small burrows or crawl spaces. They were too small to be from people, but they were too many to be random. Little lines of dirt, like something had been pushing through right underneath us. The ground was soft from the rain, so the patterns were clear. We used sticks to probe into a couple of them. They didn't go deep, maybe 2 or 3 feet. Just long, narrow tunnels weaving under where we'd been sleeping. We didn't find any animals. No fur, no tracks. But the marks on the tent bottom, the faint scuff lines, matched up with the spacing. We didn't say much on the ride home. I think we were both glad to be out of those woods. I looked it up later, tried to figure out what kind of animal builds shallow tunnels like that. Groundhogs, maybe. Moles. Nothing really explained the scraping or the way it had felt like something was watching. Looking back, it was probably nothing. Just nerves and the unfamiliar sounds of the forest. But at the time, I was dead sure something had been messing with us. Not just animals. Something or someone. But that's the thing. When you're in the middle of nowhere and something weird happens, there's no one around to tell you it was nothing. And when the sun goes down, and you're lying there in a paper-thin shelter, every noise feels like it's coming for you. I haven't been back to that spot since, and I don't think I ever will. I never used to bring anything to bed with me when I went camping alone. I always figured the wild animals in the areas I chose to go weren't going to mess with a human unless provoked. And the people? Well, I'd never had a bad run-in until this trip. Things change fast when something happens to you out there, far from anyone who can help. It's the reason now, every single time I solo camp, I keep an axe or machete within arm's reach. It started like most of my trips. I picked a spot deep in a national forest in the southern Appalachians. Not an official campground. I prefer dispersed camping. I usually plan around the weather, and this time it was supposed to be mild all weekend. Low 60s in the day, high 30s at night, clear skies. I loaded up my pack with 3 days of food, a small tent, a sleeping pad, and the usual gear. I left my car at a Forest Service access point and hiked in about 5 miles. The first day was peaceful. I found a decent clearing near a small creek. Spent the day gathering firewood, setting up camp, cooking a simple meal. As night fell, I sat by the fire listening to the crackle and the hum of insects. It felt like any other solo trip I'd done. But that first night was off. I couldn't put my finger on it. Around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly. I didn't hear anything specific at first, just the strong feeling that I needed to be awake. I sat up and listened. Nothing but the usual forest sounds. Eventually, I lay back down and tried to sleep, but I kept one ear open. My breathing never really slowed. The next day, I shook it off. Maybe it was just that I was overtired from the hike. I went about things like normal. Hiked around, took photos, made a quick lunch on my camp stove, gathered more firewood, and even fished a little in the stream with some line and hooks I brought. But I couldn't shake that feeling from the night before. Stuck to me, low in my gut all day. When night came again, I stayed up a little later, letting the fire burn longer than usual. Something about the darkness just felt heavier. I finally crawled into my tent and zipped up, trying to focus on the sound of the creek and the wind. That time, I placed the axe just to my left, near my pillow. I don't know what time it was when I heard it. A footstep. A very clear, very slow footstep. Crunch, then pause. Another. It wasn't an animal. I've heard deer. I've even heard black bears tromping through brush before. This wasn't like that. It was measured. It was careful. I sat up silently and slid my hand to the axe. My tent was dark, but the moon gave just enough light to make out shapes through the fabric. I couldn't see anything moving, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. More footsteps. They stopped about 10 feet from my tent. Whoever it was just stood there. No breathing, no shifting. Just still. I didn't make a sound. I didn't even breathe too hard. My hand was tight around the handle of the axe. I waited like that for what felt like forever. Finally, I heard the footsteps again, moving away. Crunch, crunch, slower, then fainter, then gone. I stayed up until dawn, never unzipped the tent, never even shifted my weight much, just waited. When the sun came up, I got out and looked around. No tracks. The ground was mostly leaves and soft pine needles, so it wasn't surprising. Still, it felt like a warning. I debated packing up and leaving, but something in me didn't want to run scared. I stayed a third night, but I moved my camp slightly, just enough that anyone who came back might not spot me right away. I also took a branch and dragged it behind me to cover my trail a bit. That night, I didn't even try to sleep right away. I kept the fire low and stayed sitting with the axe across my lap. Around 3 a.m., I heard the steps again, but this time they were slower, more hesitant. They came from a different direction than before, closer to the stream. I leaned forward slightly, eyes locked on the edge of the woods. Again, nothing visible, but I knew they were there. Whoever it was didn't come any closer. They stopped short this time, maybe 30 feet away. Again, they just stood there. I didn't move. I just sat there staring into the dark, axe in hand. Eventually, after maybe 20 minutes, the footsteps retreated. Again, slow and steady. That morning, I packed everything quickly. I didn't even cook breakfast. I was out of there by sunrise. When I got back to my car, I drove straight into town. I stopped at a gas station for coffee and a hot meal, and while I was standing in line, I overheard a guy talking about some weird stuff going on in the woods nearby. People's camps being messed with, some gear stolen. Nothing violent, but strange enough that it had locals on edge. That sealed it for me. Now, every time I go out into the woods alone, I sleep with an axe right next to me. Sometimes I bring a machete too, just for peace of mind. Not because I want trouble, but because I know now that there are people out there who wait for darkness to come looking. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't been still, quiet, and aware, but I know it wouldn't have been good. I still camp alone, still hike deep into places where cell phones don't work. But I'm not the same kind of camper I used to be. Now, I always trust that first gut feeling. I always sleep light, and I always keep a blade close. Because once you know what it feels like to hear footsteps circling your tent in the middle of nowhere, slow, quiet human footsteps, you never forget it. You just prepare for it happening again. I decided to head out for a solo camping trip one weekend. It had been a rough couple of months. Work stress, city noise, and just the general weight that builds up when you're stuck in a loop. I figured some time alone in the woods would do me some good. I wasn't going too far off-grid, just deep enough into a patch of state forest in a quiet part of the mountains, the kind of spot where cell service fades and the only sounds at night come from the wind through the trees and the occasional rustle in the brush. I packed light but made sure I had all the basics. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, small hatchet, a few meals, plenty of water, and some tea and coffee for the mornings. I left early Saturday morning, made the drive in silence with nothing but the hum of tires on pavement and the occasional crackle of static on the radio. Once I parked at the trailhead, it was about a 90-minute hike to where I planned to set up. It was a spot I'd been to before, a small clearing not far from a shallow creek, surrounded by thick pines and rock outcroppings. I liked it because it was far enough from the main trails that I rarely saw anyone else out there. By mid-afternoon, I had my camp set. The tent was up, I had gathered some firewood, and I boiled water for some early dinner. As the sun began to drop behind the tree line, I lit a small fire, sat back against a log, and just breathed. It was cool that night, not cold, and perfectly quiet. No planes overhead, no traffic from distant roads, just the natural quiet that made my ears almost ring at first. I didn't stay up too late, maybe a couple hours after sundown, just enough time to let the fire burn down and feel that tired weight settle into my limbs. I crawled into my tent, zipped everything up tight, and laid there listening for a bit. I heard some distant cracking of sticks now and then, but it didn't feel close. Animals, probably. Raccoons or deer, nothing big. I drifted off not long after. When I woke up, the air was cold and gray. The sun hadn't fully come up, but it was light enough to see the dew settled on everything. I unzipped my tent, pulled on a hoodie, and stepped out to stretch. That's when I noticed the cup. It was one of my enamel camping mugs, the blue one with the chipped rim. I packed two. One was still in my bag. The other was now sitting about 2 feet from where I'd had the fire the night before. It had steam marks on the side. Not just condensation, it looked like it had recently held hot water. There was liquid inside. I crouched down, careful not to knock anything, and looked into the mug. You could still see the bits floating, leaves, and some herbs. Someone had made a cup of tea using my mug, and they had drank from it. The liquid was down about 1/3 from the rim. Whoever it was had either taken a few sips or just didn't finish it. The idea that someone had been here, standing around my fire pit while I slept just feet away in the tent, hit me in the chest like a weight. I looked around immediately, trying to find prints, marks, anything. The ground was soft with dew, but also covered in needles and old leaves. I couldn't see anything clearly. No boot prints. No signs of anything missing either. My bag was untouched. The stove in place. Even the hatchet was still stuck into the stump where I'd left it. I stood there for a long time. I kept scanning the tree line, half expecting someone to be watching from behind one of the thicker trunks. There was nothing obvious. No sound. No sign of movement. I picked up the mug, smelled it. Definitely tea, something herbal. But I hadn't made it. I hadn't even boiled water yet that morning. My stove was dry. My fuel canister was full. I walked around the site a little more carefully this time, eyes low to the ground. I didn't see a single thing that gave me a clue as to who might have done it. I sat down and tried to piece it together. Someone had to come into camp quietly, take one of my mugs, boil water. Somehow, they'd have to have their own stove or means of making heat, make tea, drink some of it, and then leave. All without disturbing me or taking anything. No reason. Just made a cup of tea and left it. It didn't sit right with me. It wasn't like I'd found litter from a passing hiker or signs of someone using the area. This was deliberate, close, personal. I decided I wasn't going to spend another night there. I didn't pack in a rush. I wanted to stay calm. I wanted to be methodical, make sure I didn't forget anything in my unease. But my senses were heightened. Every crack in the woods, every flicker of movement from a bird hopping nearby set me on edge. It wasn't panic. It was more like a cold, steady alertness that just stayed with me while I packed. I hiked out by late morning, constantly checking over my shoulder. At one point I stopped, got behind a tree, and just watched the trail behind me for several minutes. I saw nothing, heard nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Back at the car, I loaded up and started the drive home. I kept going over it in my head. The idea that someone could be so close to me while I slept and do something so specific, not violent, not obviously threatening, but unsettling in the quietest, most deliberate way. Like they were trying to show me that they could get close, that I wasn't as alone as I thought. When I got home, I didn't tell anyone about it for a few days. I cleaned the mug and put it back in my gear, but I kept thinking about it, about how easy it would be for someone to track a solo camper, wait, and approach. I thought about how vulnerable a tent is, how thin the fabric is, how nothing really stops anyone from walking right up to you in the dark. A week later, I went over all my gear again. That's when I noticed something else. My tea packets, the small zip bag I kept them in, it had been moved. Not by a lot, just out of order. Normally, I kept the chamomile in front, peppermint behind, and a couple of green tea ones at the back. The green tea had been moved up. One was missing, so whoever it was hadn't just made tea. They'd gone into my bag, chosen what they wanted, put everything back. I've camped since then, but never solo. I've gone out with friends, joined groups, even camped closer to ranger stations. But I don't sleep the same out there anymore. I don't fall asleep easily, and when I do, it's never deep. I wake up a lot, listen a lot, check the area before I go to bed and again when I get up. It was just a cup of tea, but it was everything about how it happened that stuck with me. It wasn't nature. It wasn't an accident. It was someone out there in the woods showing me they were close, that they had time, that they knew I was alone, and they wanted me to know it too. I had been waiting for that weekend for weeks. Everything felt like too much back home: work, traffic, noise, people. I needed to get out. I wanted complete quiet, a real kind of silence that you only get far from everything. I wasn't new to camping. I'd done plenty of solo trips over the years, mostly in national forests and remote areas up north. This time, I picked a lesser-known stretch of forested land about 3 hours from home. It was mostly crown land, not part of a park, and that meant no rangers, no marked sites, and very few other people. That's exactly what I wanted. No distractions. I drove out Friday afternoon. It was early fall, late September, but the trees were already changing. The air had that dry, crisp smell, leaves crunching under tires as I turned off onto the unpaved access road. My truck handled the dirt just fine, even when it got narrow and uneven. After about 20 minutes down that path, I found a clearing not far from a shallow creek. It was flat, open enough for my tent, and had a line of thick pines forming a wall on the west side. You couldn't see anything past them, and I liked that. It made it feel cut off, like I was the only person left in that pocket of woods. I parked, stretched, and took my time setting up camp. Tent went up first. Then I gathered wood, cleared a ring for the fire, got water boiling for my dinner. Everything felt normal, simple, clean, the kind of rhythm I only ever found when I was out there, away from everything. The first night was uneventful, a bit chilly but not bad. I stayed up until close to midnight watching the fire die down. Then I got into my tent and crawled into the sleeping bag. Slept pretty well, aside from waking up once because of an owl hooting somewhere nearby. I listened for a minute, realized what it was, then went back to sleep. Next morning, I made oatmeal and coffee, walked a ways down the creek, then back through a patch of trees to get a better view of the hills to the south. Beautiful country, no one else out there, no sounds but birds and the breeze. Around midday, I hiked out a little further, about 3 miles east, just to scout and explore. I didn't see a soul.
No camps, no fires, no trash, nothing.
By late afternoon, I was back at camp. That evening is when things started to shift, but it was subtle at first. I just finished eating, cooked up some rice and tuna, and I was walking back from the creek with more water. I paused because I thought I heard something. It wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. Just a feeling at first, like I wasn't alone anymore. I stopped and stood still, waited. I couldn't hear anything that didn't belong. The usual crackling of branches in the breeze. A few birds, nothing else. But the feeling stayed. I wouldn't call it fear, not yet. Just a weird edge. A kind of static in the air that wasn't there before. I carried the water back, sat down, stoked the fire a bit more, and tried to shrug it off. Could have been my brain playing tricks. Sometimes being alone too long makes you hyper-aware. As darkness fell, I listened closer than usual. I noticed the woods were quieter than the night before. No more owl. No frogs either. The creek kept moving, but everything else felt still. Like even the wind had stopped. I thought about moving the truck closer to the tent, just in case. But that would have meant taking down some of my setup, and I figured I was overthinking it. That night, I didn't sleep as well. I kept waking up. Every time I stirred, I listened. There were sounds, twigs snapping, crunches spaced out, like someone or something stepping carefully. But it was always far off, like 50 yards or more. And I kept telling myself it was probably a deer, or a raccoon, maybe a bear, could have been anything. Still, I stayed in the tent longer than usual the next morning. Unzipped it slowly, checked around the camp before stepping out. Nothing seemed disturbed. No prints, no food taken. I boiled water, drank coffee, but I didn't eat much. My stomach was tight. I told myself I'd pack up and hike out if I felt worse later. But by noon, I felt better. The sun was out, warm even. I left camp again and walked a good distance, taking photos, climbing over deadfall. I found an old hunting stand in the trees, mostly rotted out. Didn't look like anyone had used it in years. But as I made my way back around mid-afternoon, I noticed something. A small stack of stones at the base of a birch tree. Not natural, not weather-placed, stacked by hand. 3 flat stones, each smaller than the one below it. Perfect balance. I hadn't seen it on the way out. I was sure of that. It was close to the trail I'd used. I didn't touch it. I didn't even get close. I just stared at it for a while. My hands were cold, even though the sun was out. I felt that thing again, like the forest was holding its breath. I walked faster on the way back. Didn't stop. Got to camp and started packing. I didn't want to sleep out there again. I had most of my gear ready to go by 5 p.m., but I'd have to drive the trail back in the dark if I left then. That bothered me, so I compromised. I set up my chair, sat facing the thick woods, and waited for dark. I figured I'd keep the fire going bright, stay alert, and if anything felt off again, I'd get in the truck and go no matter the time. Around 9 p.m., something changed again. The fire was still going, bright and crackling. I'd fed it with everything I had, trying to keep the light strong. I was sitting quietly when I heard movement behind me, toward the truck. I turned quick. Nothing in sight. Just the truck, the shadows of trees, and the edge of the creek catching firelight. Then I looked back toward the forest and I saw a figure. Not up close, maybe 40 or 50 feet back, half behind a tree. Just a shoulder and part of a head. Human-sized. Still, no movement. Just there, watching. I didn't breathe, didn't move. I blinked, looked again. It was still there. I stood up, reached for my flashlight, clicked it on. The beam cut through the dark, bounced around the trees. Nothing. The figure was gone. I held the light steady, walked forward maybe 5 steps, swept the trees again. Still nothing. Then I heard running. Fast, heavy steps crashing through brush, moving away. Not animal. Too upright. I didn't chase. I turned, grabbed what was left unpacked, my sleeping bag, the water container, and threw it in the truck bed. Didn't fold anything. Didn't care. I got in the truck, started it, and backed out fast. Headlights swung across the trees, and for a split second, I swear, I saw someone just beyond the edge of camp, standing, then gone again. I drove that trail like hell. My suspension took a beating. Every pothole jarred the frame. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. I kept driving another hour before I finally pulled into a gas station, parked under the lights, and sat there breathing hard. I didn't go to the police. What would I say? That I saw someone in the woods? That there was a stack of stones? They wouldn't do anything. No crime had happened, and maybe it hadn't. But I knew something wasn't right out there. I wasn't imagining it. When I got home, I left my gear in the truck. I took a long shower. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house made my heart jump. I stayed up until sunrise. A week later, I checked the area online. Forums, backcountry threads, old posts. I found one mention, just one, from a guy who'd camped there years back. He said he'd had a weird experience. Stones stacked near his fire, heard footsteps, felt watched, left early. He didn't give details, said he never went back. I haven't either. I still camp, still go off-grid sometimes, but I never returned to that place. And I always trust that feeling now when the woods go quiet, when something shifts. That tension in the air. You learn to listen to it, because some places don't want you there, and some people don't want to be found. Not in stories, not in dreams, just deep in the trees where the world stops watching. And if you find one of their markers, stones, sticks, anything that looks placed, don't touch it. Don't look long. Turn around and go before it's too late.